So we're going to use create React app to bootstrap a new app here, and then we're going to add Tailwind CSS to it. So with that done, we can cd into CRA Tailwind, and we'll open up VS Code. And then back in the terminal, there's a few more packages we need to add, so I'm going to yarn add them. You can use npm install if you're using npm. Tailwind has its own package. npm run all is going to let us run commands in parallel. And chokedar CLI is going to watch files for changes, and then we're going to tell it to rerun the Tailwind build whenever some CSS files change. So with that done, we'll pop back over to VS Code and open up package.json. So you can see we've got our 3 new packages here, and we've got the default set of scripts that come with Create React App. We're going to add some new scripts here. The first one we'll add is a build::tailwind command. And this is going to call Tailwind, which is a command line tool that was installed from this package. And we'll call build on it and build the source/tailwind.css file. And we'll output to source/tailwind.output.css. None of these files exist yet, but we'll create those in a minute. Then we'll add a second script called watch Tailwind. And this is going to run chokedar, and we need to pass files for it to watch. So we're going to look at source/everything/star.css and source/everything/star.scss. And then we want to explicitly ignore the source tailwind output.css file that we are building, because it matches this CSS extension and we don't want some infinite loop of builds. And finally, we need to tell this chokedar what command to run when one of these things changes. And for that, we're going to run npm run build::tailwind, which is the name of our script here. So now we can use these scripts in a couple other places. The first is when we want to start up our dev server. We'd like to do the Tailwind build and then watch and start up Create React App at the same time. So we're going to do that by renaming start to start::react. And we'll add a replacement start script. And this is going to use that npm run all command to first run the build Tailwind script to kick off a build. And then in parallel, we're going to watch Tailwind and start React. Now we need this initial build so that the CSS output is available before Create React App starts up. And then the watch will make sure to rebuild this thing if anything changes. The last thing we need to do is make sure that when we run a production build, that we kick off this Tailwind build first. To do that, we can add a script called prebuild. And this is a special name that'll tell npm and yarn to run this script before the build script. So this will run the Tailwind build first, wait until that's done, and then run our React app build. So before we can test this out, we've got to create a source Tailwind CSS file. So let's go over to our source directory and make a tailwind.css. And I'll paste in the default Tailwind config. This is what the docs recommend for a base Tailwind config. And you can add things here. You need to look at the docs for where you should add things, because it's not always at the bottom or always at the top. It depends on what you want to change. But so we'll start off with this file here, and we need to import the generated file now into our app, which doesn't exist yet, but it will by the time we start it up. So inside our index file, we're going to import tailwind.output.css. And now in our terminal, if we run yarn build, you'll see that it builds Tailwind first and then runs the React scripts build. So we get this Tailwind output, and now it's doing the React build. I'll stop this because we don't really want to do this build right now. But now, just to prove that it works, we can remove the source Tailwind output, and we'll run yarn start. And this is going to start up our dev server, but before it does, it'll create that Tailwind CSS file here, and then start up our dev server. And let me pull that over now. So let's make sure everything's working. We'll go over to our app.js file, which is this component here. And we'll replace this app component with one that uses some Tailwind classes. And we can get rid of logo. We don't use app CSS anymore. And we can see it's working over here. So just to see how the build works, let's pull up this terminal, and I'll leave it open as we change some stuff. If I go and change the text color here to like text red and hit save, this is going to rebuild Create React App, but it won't rebuild Tailwind because we haven't changed any CSS files. You'll see the build is really fast, and then we get our red text here. If we wanted to add some custom class, let's say we'll call it like our red. Right now that doesn't exist, so the text is black. So now let's go over to our Tailwind CSS and we'll add our red, and we'll just make the text color solid red. And now you can see it's going to rebuild the Tailwind output first, and then because that file changed, create React app is going to rebuild, and then we get our red text here. So the build is a bit slower when you change CSS, but if you're writing things the Tailwind way by using class names, you won't be changing the CSS much anyway. So that takes care of the dev server. Let's make sure the production build is working. We'll run a yarn build. And it works, but our output CSS is huge. We have 1.8 megabytes of CSS, and we don't really want to make our users download this. So I'm just going to stop this again. We're going to create a Tailwind config file that'll tell Tailwind to strip out some of the unused CSS classes. So at the top level of the project, alongside package.json, we'll make a Tailwind config.js, and then we'll paste in some config here. So this is all pretty much default, except the stuff I've added to the purge array here. And this is telling purge CSS which files to look in for class names being used. So what purge is going to do is look through all of your JS, JSX, TypeScript, HTML, and public TSX files, and look for class names being used. So it's going to see in this file, it's going to see we're using MX Auto, it's going to see we're using Text2XL, our red, all this stuff, and it's going to know that these class names are being used, so they shouldn't be stripped out. So with that in place, we can just rerun the build. And you can see the Tailwind part, well, it's still 1.8 megs. And that's because the purge step only runs if the node environment is set to production. So we need to pass node end set to production as an environment variable. Then the purge is going to run, and our output is going to be 12 kilobytes. That's way better than the 1.8 megs we had before. You can see once create React app is done, the bundled CSS, it's telling us after gzipping that is going to be like 1.7K, and that's great. So with that, we're all set. We've got our Tailwind build steps set up for both the production build and the dev server build. We've got our purge CSS config set up so that we're not shipping massive CSS bundles to our users, and we're importing the generated output in our index file, so this will make it available to the entire app without having to import it in every component, because CSS is globally available. The last thing we might want to do is make sure not to check this Tailwind output into our source control, because it's a generated file, and it's going to change whether you're doing production build versus dev build, so we really want to ignore this file. So I'm going to go over to our git ignore file and just add it to the bottom. And that way, similar to how you don't check in the build directory, we just won't be checking in this file that changes all the time.